Okay, so good morning and welcome to our webinar for this morning. And our conversation today will revolve around transformative development in the context of Asian societies. This webinar conversation is brought to you by the Ateneo Department of Sociology and Anthropology in cooperation with the University for Peace in Costa Rica, the Nippon Foundation, and the Asian Peacebuilders Scholarship Program. For today, we have with us two distinguished resource speakers who will talk about their conceptualizations, their experiences, and their insights about the prospects and the possibilities of transformative development in Asian societies. Today, we will begin with Professor Vedi Hadiz of the University of Melbourne. Professor Hadiz is Director and Professor of Asian Studies at the Asia Institute and an Assistant Deputy Vice Chancellor International at the University of Melbourne. He was previously Professor of Asian Societies and Politics at Murdoch University's Asia Research Center and Director of its Indonesia Research Program. His research interests revolve around political sociology and political economy issues, especially those related to the contradictions of development in Indonesia and Southeast Asia more broadly, and more recently in the Middle East. Today, he will be talking about Indonesia's democratization process, which he argues is a form of democratization without transformation. So without further ado, we welcome Professor Vedi Hadiz. Good morning, Professor.
Okay, good morning. I'm a bit slow with these gadgets. So thank you, Enrique, for your introduction. Thank you, everybody, for coming to hear me. It's been, I suppose, about 6 months that I've had time to get used to these sorts of presentations through Zoom, rather than meeting people face to face, which is what I prefer. And this still seems, very alien and very alienating to me. But hopefully we can have a productive discussion nevertheless. So as Enrique was saying, what I'm talking about is basically an experience of democratization without transformation. And I'm talking about Indonesia. The Indonesian case specifically, but I am interested in sort of drawing out some comparisons here and there, which I might mention a bit during this talk, but also we can also delve into during the questions if people are so inclined. Now, oh yeah, I should apologize for the fact that I don't have PowerPoints. I know that the next speaker does. So I apologize for that. I'm actually not a great fan of PowerPoints. Enrique might remember that when we were in NUS together, I used to use PowerPoint for teaching purposes, but I actually didn't enjoy that at all, and only did it because students actually expected it, especially in Singapore. But anyway, so going to the substance of the talk. Now, I'm of a certain age, which means that I was, before I became an academic, I was a student and an NGO and political activist around the 1980s. And during that time, for my generation of activists in Indonesia and in Southeast Asia more broadly, because we did have a network at that time, Enrique is much too young to know about this, but we, notwithstanding our differences, some of us may have been more liberal than the others, or more leftist than the others. So notwithstanding all the differences, we thought that basically democracy would be, a cure-all almost for all the problems that we were facing as societies. And these included things like rampant corruption, abuse of power, infringements on human rights, inequities in development, et cetera, et cetera. And we thought that as long as we can have democracy, we could have the kinds of social transformations that would result in the addressing of these problems. I remember that when People's Power took place in the Philippines in 1986, how excited the entire region was. It wasn't just Filipinos who were excited. I remember speaking soon after the fall of Marcos with some luminaries in the Philippines, people that some of you will know of. And they were spreading the great news about how Marcos had fallen and all things were now possible in the Philippines and all that. And we in Indonesia were very excited about that, although it did occur to me that just a few years after that, many of the same people in the Philippines that had been so excited had become quite noticeably less excited within a few years, given the actual constraints to real reform that were imposed structurally. So I did have this in mind when in 1998, Indonesia had its own 1986. And this took place in the midst of the Asian economic crisis. Some of you may remember that this was a period of great turmoil in the region where, the economic manifestations of COVID today in some ways mirror that crisis in 97, 98, although today's crisis is global in nature and is hitting the heart of the major capitalist economies of the world, whereas the Asian economic crisis, although it was feared to sort of spill over into Europe and other parts of the world, was really contained in East Asia. But the effects were really great, so that there were political ramifications. And in Indonesia, the political ramifications were that the New Order regime of Suharto, who was arguably the last of the great capitalist dictators of the Cold War era, was finally overthrown after 3 decades in power. I'm sad to say that he was finally overthrown in 1998 when I stopped trying to overthrow him. Because I had by that time become a staid academic and was no longer particularly active in the civil society organizing arena or anything close to that. But anyway, it was an exciting period as well. But I did remember the lessons of the Philippines. And I thought, well, let's just not get overexcited. It's great that this fellow is finally out of office, and there are all kinds of possibilities now that certainly were not open for 3 decades. But we must try to also, I think, well, that was my line in 98, 99, 2000 in Indonesia as an academic activist, saying that we should actually be worried about the ability of the old forces to reorganize within a new political environment, which I think is partly what happened in the Philippines. So what we have in Indonesia now is a democracy. Indonesia is considered to be the world's 3rd largest democracy after India and the United States. We do have free elections, we do have freedom of the press, freedom of organization, and so on. But, and this is a thesis which I've developed over quite a long time, that Indonesian democracy is still being dominated by the same socio-economic forces that had dominated Indonesian authoritarianism from 1966 to 1998, the Suharto New Order era. And my byword for these social and economic forces is oligarchy. I talk about how an array of forces which represent the fusion of politico-bureaucratic and big corporate interest, was nurtured under the New Order, and they have, even though they did take a big knock in the economic crisis of 97, 98, and the reformasi movement in Indonesia subsequently, they were able to eventually reorganize. And today we find that oligarchic forces or different factions of oligarchy actually are in control of most of the major political parties in Indonesia, most of the major social organizations, and they are able to actually use institutions of democracy, political parties, elections, the press, etc., to actually insulate themselves against popular forces and to actually maintain their political and economic ascendancy. So the thesis here really is that oligarchy may not actually necessarily contradict democracy, that oligarchy and democracy can go together, which I think is probably the case in the Philippines as well, actually, where you have oligarchic families, some of them long-standing, some of them relatively newer, more provincial, etc., which have control over much of the political and socio-economic spheres. So that is the situation that I think we find ourselves in Indonesia today. And part of the reason that we have that is that actually, in contrast to the Philippines or Thailand, New Order authoritarianism was much more, let's say, effective and maybe efficient. I like to say that during the Marcos era, perhaps there were always portions of the Philippines in which the state or the symbols of the state would disappear because they were controlled by by the Moro front or by the communists. But in Indonesia, you go to the most remote village in the most remote part of Indonesia in 97, 98, and you would still find the symbols of the state. The picture of Suharto and the Garuda, the symbol of the Indonesian state. They would be there. I mean, so the tentacles of the state, sort of pervaded, through all levels of state and society in a way that I think it never quite managed to do in the Philippines or even in Thailand, actually, in spite of a military dominance over the social and political sphere since the 1930s. So the weakness and disorganization of civil society after 1998 actually made it more possible for these old oligarchic forces to reorganize, because there were no really strong streams of political liberalism or of social democracy, certainly not of leftist politics in Asia, because the Communist Party was famously or infamously destroyed very violently in 65 and 66, when hundreds of thousands, if not more than 1 million Indonesians perished. So that disorganization of civil society, that context of disorganization, really allowed these old forces to reorganize. And really, within 3-4 years or so, that had already been established, I think, and that is the case up to now. It is one of the theses that I would actually state. Now, so what we have here is that in spite of elections, in spite of the things that one associates with the running and the institutional frameworks of a democracy, you don't really have the empowerment of especially the most vulnerable sections of society. So, for example, ethnic and religious minority groups remain extremely vulnerable to violence from the state or extra state actors. And a lot of these things have to do with, I'll have to explain that maybe in question time, but having to do with intra-oligarchic conflict where sort of nationalist sentiment or religious sentiment is mobilized to buttress this and that faction of the oligarchy when they are in competition with each other, usually during election time, right? So we've got all these institutions, we've got all of this, all of these so-called freedoms, but at the same time, things like human rights, are not particularly well protected, especially for the most vulnerable people in society, including women. And also social inequalities actually have increased since democratization, which is also the case in the Philippines. In the late New Order period, from the late 80s up to the late 90s, there had begun a dramatic, period of growth in social inequalities, even if you only counted it from the instrument of the Gini ratio, which a lot of economists use. Now, that has continued almost unabated up to now. That growing, inequality, and when there's some step backs, but the level of inequality now in 2020 in Indonesia is actually greater, much greater than it was in 1998. So, you've got democracy, but without social economic justice, right? And I think that's partly because of, the balance of power that has entrenched itself within this democratic framework, whereby old oligarchic forces still continue to dominate. Just to make some comparisons, I think that I wouldn't want to be misunderstood, by the way, to say that nothing has changed, because a lot of things have changed. It's just that I think that people expected too much in 1998. Including analysts of Indonesia, and that was the case in the Philippines too in 1986, according to my recollection. Analysts expected too much of the Philippines in 1986. So rather than that sort of cure-all that we had been imagining, we still have these problems that democracy itself doesn't seem to be sufficient in itself to address. So that's one thing I want to say. That even though we have that situation, we could still say though that, for example, for myself, I would, unlike in the 1980s, now write articles in the newspaper without really being worried about whether I'd be arrested or not. And that's, that is something. And people can, write things that are critical of leaders and so on in ways that they couldn't do in the 1980s. And that is significant. So it's not that things have not changed at all, but things have not changed in the way that people would have maybe imagined. And also, in spite of all my criticism of Indonesia, I'd have to say that the situation in Indonesia maybe is not as bad as other situations in Southeast Asia. So Thailand, for example, was since the 1980s put up as this sort of example of democratization in Southeast Asia. But now, of course, you have a basically a military regime controlling power in the Philippines, and you've got things. You've got an array of social forces centered on the military and on the royal family that seems to be acting as a bastion against reform. In Malaysia, there was a lot of excitement about the defeat of the ruling party since the 1950s, UMNO, in the election recently, but by a coalition of parties that was led by a former prime minister who ruled for a long time. Yet there was a lot of excitement about that. Now we find that UMNO is again in power, right? And really, not much has changed in Malaysia in spite of that excitement of just a year or two ago. In the Philippines, I would have to say, I mean, with all due respect to my colleagues in the Philippines, that the world does not look very well, is not very well disposed towards Duterte's war on crime and war on drugs, which infringes on human rights, and also the drift towards what seems to be a lot of authoritarian tendencies in the Philippines, which would only go against, I think, the interests of civil society groups, and maybe of the sorts of groups that the next speaker will be talking about after I finally stop talking. So just a couple more points. I see that it's already 1 o'clock. A couple more points. So why is it that we can have democratization without transformation? Well, first of all, I think that the possibility of democratization and of transformation really emerges in times of crisis. But times of crisis themselves don't actually guarantee that the result will be the kind of democracy or the kind of social transformation that people who are progressive or democratic and so on would be inclined towards. What is really important really is whether there is something socially coherent with a strong social base that is able to provide an alternative to what actually exists now. And that's what we didn't have in 1998 in Indonesia, right? We didn't have a coherent civil society-based movement or coalition of movements that had an alternative vision of Indonesia. There was no ideology that put people together. There was nothing really that could impose itself as a replacement for the old social order or the interests that represented the old social order. And that is, I think, a similar problem that is being faced in other parts of Southeast Asia, and actually in many democratization experiences in other parts of the world. So when you don't have that kind of thing, the alternative to the sort of status quo or the coalition of social forces that actually underpins that status quo, what you might have is not transformation of power, but just its reorganization, whereby old forces sort of reconfigure things and so on, perhaps provide, allow for freedoms, this and that kind of freedom that we might be happy with, but at the same time are able to maintain their overall ascendancy over the social, political, and economic spheres. So therefore, you get democratization without transformation. I think, would that be sufficient, Enrique? It's past 1 o'clock now.
That's great, actually. That's insightful, Professor. Thank you for your time. Can you still stick for for the questions?
Yeah, all right. Sure. Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Hadiz, for emphasizing parallels, between among Southeast Asian societies when it comes to and the pervasiveness still of socio-economic forces that have reigned supreme for a long time, so to speak. So at this juncture, we would like to thank Professor Hadiz, and we would like to proceed to our second speaker for this morning. Our second speaker is Miss Easterluna Luz Canoy. She is an NGO leader of an indigenous group that is based in Bukidnon. And today she will be talking about transformative development in Asia, indigenous peoples' notions of practices and pathways to development. This presentation of hers particularly brings in the development perspectives and experiences of indigenous peoples of northern Mindanao region, particularly those based in Mount Kitanglad Range Natural Park in Bukidnon, South Philippines. It locates these experiences and perspectives within the transformative development discourse in Asia, as it further seeks an extensive and nuanced understanding of the IP's cultural context, cultural practices, and partnerships and engagements. So we now invite Ms. Canoy to the conversation. Good morning, Ms. Canoy.
Good morning to everyone. I'd like to thank you for inviting me to share our experience in working in Mount Kitanglad, particularly in my NGO, the Kitanglad Integrated NGOs. So what I'm going to share is about the indigenous peoples' notions, practices, and pathways to development as they work in the protected area management. This sums up about almost 20 years plus working with indigenous people in Mount Kitanglad. And this is a very unique case because mostly in protected areas, there's always an exclusive governance or dominance of the state. But in the case of Kitanglad, we have the indigenous peoples as organic partner in protected area management. So before I proceed, there's just basic topics that needs to be considered in looking at the development pathway in terms of the indigenous peoples of Mount Kitanglad. First, you have to look at the unique characteristic of the people there. They're indigenous. They have unique culture, and this culture survives many, many hundreds of years from colonialization, and until now, culture remains vibrant, and culture is part in moving forward as we see the future still with their cultural integrity intact. Second, I'm going to introduce you to a world of nature, a wonderful nature in Mount Kitanglad, Bukidnon, because from this environment, we have a good platform for development. So the mountains, the rivers form important watersheds. And this is where abundance and prosperity thrives for every nation, for every country. So from these two aspects, you can see that there's already a bountiful natural capital, economic capital in Bukidnon, but as well as cultural capital. And this fulfills all vital ecosystem services that is fundamental to the basic life of a human being. So in terms of development, we're familiar with development. There is this concept of development with cultural integrity, because for indigenous people, the the protection of culture and tradition is very important aspect if they want to collaborate with government. And this aspiration is also embedded in the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, or the Republic Act 8371, which was enacted in 1997. So we have a guiding principle, which is autonomous for the tribe, but there's also the law that reinforces the rights of Indigenous people. We are also familiar with the development goals. The United Nations development goals, it started in year 2000. We have the 8 Millennium Development Goals that is committed to collaborations of nations to reduce poverty, hunger, illiteracy, address diseases, and then come 2015 to 2030, we are now in the Sustainable Development Goals. This is also the blueprint to achieve better and sustainable future. And for now, some of the elements of the goals also include considerations to mitigation and adaptation to climate change. But question, is there a cultural lens in looking at these development goals? Perhaps the narrative of Kitanglad will give us an idea that perhaps some of these goals have already been achieved and we are still working towards its fulfillment, and we need all the support possible for us to reach the achievement of these goals. In terms of local context, this is how you see the Indigenous people. Mount Kitanglad is the ancestral domain. So we have 3 tribes that have unified claim in Mount Kitanglad. They are the Talandig, the Bukidnon, and Higaonon. And their ancestral domain, because we are now in the generations of protected areas, as early as 1990, the ancestral domain was proclaimed as a national park. And then in 1992, with the NIPAS law, that means the National Integrated Protected Area System, the national park was transformed into a protected area. That's why it's under the natural park category. So the importance of proclaiming Mount Kitanglad as a protected area is for the reason that to treasure its biodiversity that needs to be conserved for generations. And since there are people inside the protected area, it's also to strive for development. So sustainable development is already embedded as early as in the 1992 NIPAS law. The parks should be managed in this manner. But aside from the twin goals, since we're working in Kitanglad as an NGO, connecting the state and the tribes, we added a 3rd goal, that is cultural survival. Because we know and we believe that there's no guarantee to sustainably protect the forest if we do not include the element of culture of the Indigenous people. So what happens is that the Kitanglad Indigenous people, they live in their ancestral domain, but their ancestral domain is also transformed into a protected area. But still they practice their batasan, their customary law. So despite the overwhelming influence of the protected area, but the cultural practice of the tribe remains very strong. So the tribes strongly assert about their culture. So when they meet the government, then they meet the agencies, especially in the resource use, the use of the forest, entry to the forest, doing biodiversity assessment, or any cultural resources documented, they have to go through ritual processes, and the tribes must be consulted about the objectives of any endeavor. So next slide, you can see that this is the past-present picture. So for any consultation, there's always element of culture there. IP leaders, when they are being summoned by government, or the tribes themselves have ever conducted without a ritual, either a full ritual or a simple ritual, because the intention is, in the absence of ritual, perhaps the meeting will not be successful. So the conduct of ritual is to ensure that discussions are harmonious and conflict can be negotiated and resolved. So this is one example of Mount Kitanglad. This is in the case of the Bukidnon tribe, the people of Daraguyan, because they live near the Daraguyan Peak mountain. So in their community, you can see an altar facing the whole Mount Kitanglad range. And then they say that their practice of culture to respect nature, the mountains, the natural resources, the rivers, um, the forest, because basically it supports their life. So it is also their home. Uh, these are actually natural cathedrals. No, they consider these mountains as the church. It's also a market because they get their food, and more importantly, for medicines, when someone is ill, they get their medicines from the forest. So the mountain range has there are a dozen of peaks in Mount Kitanglad, and each peak or each mountain has a tribal name, and that denotes the close affinity of the tribes with the mountain forest. So if you're curious where is Mount Kitanglad, this is a map of Bukidnon. So you can see there's only very few forest blocks. So Mount Kitanglad is located at the center. It's about 47,000 hectares of forest. And then it's been proclaimed as a permanent protected area. So it has its own law, the Mount Kitanglad Protected Area Act, which is enacted in year 2000. And 9 years later, because of the success in the conservation work, the partnership with government, the indigenous peoples, and all stakeholders, it garnered a recognition to become one of the ASEAN Heritage Park. That was in 2009. But from this point, from my narrative, it's very clear that there's two types of governance that manages Kitanglad. So we have the Protected Area Management Board, which is a requirement by law for protected area management. So it's a multi-stakeholder management in which the Council of Elders or the tribal representatives are part of the structure. So you can see two strong authorities that ensures the protection of biodiversity, the culture, and ensure sustainable development in this protected area. So you can see some of the good shots of one of our volunteers, Bong Banwa of the Mount Kitanglad. This is how it is now. You can see really intact forest. And then Mount Dulang is considered the second highest peak in the country. So this is also the tallest peak in Mount Kitanglad. It has other sacred mountains called Tuminungan, Akulang, Daraguyan, many of which are very is being revered with due high respect by the tribes. But these forests are actually watersheds of important rivers in the region. This includes Cagayan de Oro River, the Taguluan River, the Pulangi River, and Manupali River. So this is the critical importance of Mount Kitanglad in terms of its ecological value, being the source of water for the entire northern Mindanao. And then since it's also a protected area, it has very rich flora and fauna, or a large wildlife that largely, I would say, remains undocumented, especially for the flora. But it's been famous for bird watching, trekking, and so many research studies in terms of uh, flowers, ferns, insects are being also undertaken in Mount Kitanglad. Bird watching, because it's an important bird area, so many mountaineers, explorers come to Kitanglad because they can see the nesting site of Philippine eagle. And Philippine eagle is a critically endangered species, but we're lucky in Mount Kitanglad, there are about 4 nesting sites existing in the park. And there's also other bird species, almost 200 of them, and they're endemic birds. We also have mammals like Nino, there's wild deer, wild pig, there's also monkeys, junior, flying lemur, tarsier, so many wildlife that exist in the forest of Mount Kitanglad. So this is an example of the different birds. in Mount Kitanglad, and it's actually famous for bird watching. Next, the cultural context. So how do we understand culture? In indigenous peoples living in ancestral domains, there's also a protected area because of this abundant biodiversity resources. First, you have to look at their spiritual beliefs and practices. And there's also a political structure of governance. So they have male and female chieftains, the Dato or Bai, governing every community. But aside from these leaders, they also have invisible leaders, or that also comprise the invisible elements. So interestingly, if you look at indigenous governance, it navigates between the visible world and the unseen world. So later on, you will see how it interplays in their life and management. There's also cultural assertion, and there's also good thing about it because the government also accept, accommodate, and normalize some of the indigenous practices. There remains intertribal dynamics because sometimes being indigenous, they're being left out. Being indigenous, they're also given special importance. And then, and in some aspects, when benefits come, they see that it's the Christian population always get the first benefit. So there's always this notion of it's good for them, not for us. And then interestingly, in the topic of development, the tribes are now required to come up with their own ancestral domain management plan, which under IPRA is called the ADS-DPP, the Ancestral Domain Sustainable Development Protection Plan. So in the picture here, you can see that this is a result of a ritual to seek apology. For the case wherein the military had bombing operation in one of the parts of Kitanglad that hit a sacred place. So this is very unique because the leader of the tribe in Bainatlawan, they summoned. She asked the Pambi, can you be the instrument that we can summon the head of the military so that we can ask them to appear before the council, explain the incident, and they need to go through a sorry ritual. Why? Because in the bombing incident, it's not just the birds, the eagle who were disturbed, but most importantly, the nature spirits that safeguard intact forests. So this is also a message for the tribe that during metallization or insurgency, as much as possible, please do not harm the forest that the tribes have been taking care of for so many generations. And true enough, they have a very good commander in Colonel Gapus. He showed up with his men. And this is actually the first time that the armed forces of the Philippines recognize culture. They recognize cultural authorities. And in the act, in the sorry ritual, they also pronounce like in times of peace and order security problem, they will also have to make sure that they will coordinate with indigenous leaders, especially if they will enter into the area. So this is one good compromise that came out in this case of the that happened in 2012. So what happens when the IPs under culture was under park management? So there's actually a very strong impact because of the NIPAS law. One, it introduces a multi-stakeholder management system, but the tribes are part of the PAMB, the Protected Area Management Board. So the Datu and the Bai in the structure becomes part of the PAMB. But in terms of the area, there's cultural zones, there's sacred zones, but it turns out that these zones are also touristic destinations where bird watchers, mountaineers, trekkers, and even researchers, they come to the area. So what used to be exclusive prayer grounds of the tribe becomes an open space for tourism. And this is what happens when the protected area is subsumed over ancestral domain. So it it needs partnership. So the tribes would have to say to the government what is strictly strict protection zone because it is recognized in the protected area law. But the tribes would have to say which parts of the mountains are really very highly restricted for outsiders, especially for the praying grounds. So the partnership of the tribes with the Protected Area Management Board already lasted for 2 decades. But in those years, it is characterized with contest, conflict, especially on the claims. There's also cultural violations if the outsider does not know about the cultural protocol. And there's a lot of mediation, negotiation, and compromise. The tribes compromise, the government also compromise. So what are the best case examples of this compromise? For instance, Kitanglad visitors, especially the first time, if ever they enter sacred parts of Kitanglad, they need to go through a cleansing ritual, a pamalas, because if the tribes observe very strongly a particular spiritual practice inside a protected forest, outsiders would have to also pay respect to those practices. So they see that the cleansing ritual is for one to be worthy to enter sacred grounds. And as a one descendant of the tribe said that in the absence of ritual, there's no tribe to speak of. The tribe will die. So that's why it's very important that the cultural practice of cleansing remains strong until now. So this is the framework to look at and understand culture. This is um, conceptualized by Dr. Mikitay Viksaway in 1995 when our NGO in Kin started its role to mediate between government and indigenous people. So there's got to be a way to guide advocates, allies, the government, even the church, everyone, if they would have business inside protected areas, they have to look at this framework. The framework, if you look at this, there's a symbol of a man standing, and there's arrow that points at the right, which considers the cultural experts. The human that stands in the drawing shows the structure of the head, the heart, the stomach, the arms, and the feet. And what is very important, the territory, the Mount Kitanglad, as the standing ground for the tribe to prosper in in coordination in the full functions of this in terms of their culture. So their culture contains faith, their religious system. Their culture also has oral literature. So you can see in the drawing, the faith is in on top of the head. Uh, they say on top of the head because it sees broadly and also connect to the divine. The oral literature, the history, education, and art is a function of the mouth because this is education. And this is where you have the oralists, the chanters, the educators of the tribe. The heart symbolizes the customary law. The tribe is not functioning if it doesn't have, it cannot enforce its customary law. So there you have the arbitrators of the community of conflict. Obviously, in the stomach part, you can see the indigenous health and traditional medicine. So that's where you can see the role of the healers or the ritualists. And then, of course, the livelihood, the economists, the farmers that also responsible for the food security of the tribe. Interestingly, the arms on the feet represents tribal guards. The limaong, the pagalad, the tribal guardians, because every community is is complete if has its own defense system. And then, of course, on the ground is the Mount Kitanglad. In the next slide, you can see the different cultural experts. For the brain in the drawing of the in the previous slide, you can see the belief system, the religious practices, which are the functions of the bailans, the shamans, the healers, and ritualists. So always believe when you enter in a territory, there's always culture experts that are responsible for their spiritual practice. The senses represents the oral traditions, histories, chants, gongs, music, expressed in the mouth, felt in the hands, and received by the ears. So this is the role of the gugud, the historians, the chanters, the baligna or educators, and all artists. The heart, the customary laws, as mentioned earlier, are there to strengthen the smooth brotherly relationships of the tribe. That's why they have balaghusay, balaghusay, arbitrators, mediators, among datus and bais. In the function of the stomach and the intestines, they have farming technologies. They also have hunting, food gathering, blacksmithing, handicrafts. These are the functions of other members of the communities who are farmers, hunters, weavers, blacksmiths. And the hands and the feet, the defense and the security system of the community uh, talks about the Alimaong, Bagani, Pagalad, the different names associated with tribal warriors. There's also the invisible part of culture. They call it the pillars of life. They are the eight guardian spirits of nature. Unfortunately, in this part, I could not mention the names. I can only describe them because these spirits are considered to be the pillars of life and they are under the care of the Datu or Bai cultural experts through a mindful practice of their skills, knowledge, and wisdom in their territories. So each Datu or a Bai, they have ritual spirits assigned to them. And these spirits of nature are present during the time of creation, but it has not been told how they became guardians of nature. So over the years, this has not been documented from oral tradition. The shaman ritualist knows the nature spirits, and for every ritual, he or she can summon. Like for instance, in the COVID ritual, if the Babaylan summon the spirit of earth, the spirit of the wind, the spirit of water, because these three elements play important role in the COVID pandemic. So earth can protect us, water can protect us, the wind can protect us. But the case is, instead of just praying for protection, the prayer started with a sorry, and apologies. Why? Because human beings abuse nature. We pollute the water, we polluted earth, also the air, the wind. So how can we ask for protection if we abuse this nature surroundings? So in the conduct of the tribal ritual, it is the chance for humanity to say sorry and to ask for protection. And when the tribes prayed for COVID, they pray for the security and safety, not just for the members, but for all people. Not just for Bukidnon, for Mindanao, but for all people in the world. That's how expansive their compassion and their hearts are. So how about development? So what are the thoughts of the leaders about development? It is very obvious that spiritual belief and practices are very strong in Bukidnon, in Mount Kitanglad. So for instance, for Dato Dumapal, we asked him, observing the dynamics now, because there are already people interfacing the community, because they're now part of the protected area. He observes that with many religions coming into the tribe, he said that there are many religions and it adhere to the same God. And we call him in different names. For our case in the tribe, we call the God Magbabaya, the Creator, to whom we are deeply connected. But aside from the Magbabaya, we also pray to the spirit of the soil, the spirit of earth, because it gives us food to eat. We also pray for the spirit who takes care of our houses, because it protects us from the sun, the rain, and the cold. Same way, they protect to the spirit of water, because water, if you drink from it, becomes part of life. So this is the how the tribe described their faith in nature. In terms of development, it's very interesting because when I asked Dr. Damapal about development, I have no indigenous term for development. I only have a Bisaya, a Cebuano term, Talambuan for development. So it took a while for the chieftain to understand what are you trying to ask me about development. So finally, reflecting as I give examples, we just say, okay, development for us is synonymous to pagtabulon. It is the ability to improve a situation. It's a human ability to improve a situation that is no longer practical. It is a process of adaptation and coping that stems from simple experiences, like fixing a basket. If you need a bigger basket because it cannot contain the load, you have to fix a basket, come up with a bigger one. Or you can expand one's field to apply a new method to accommodate more crops. He calls it the tabula uma. And also, it is something like you can correct a and you can improve the structure of your house or the tabula balay. So development is like pursuing something that makes lives better than before. I also asked the Babaylan, Bainatlawan, about development. And he says that the culture and development must go together. Because if you have development without culture, we will lose culture eventually. But on the other hand, with just culture alone, with the demands of modernization, uh, the economic changes so much. She said we can no longer survive. So we accept changes and development, but only those that help us and do not make us oblivious of culture and tradition. So this is the restraint. They go for development, but they have to value culture. So culture will always be at the backdrop. On religion, faith, and rituals, uh, Bai said that we respect other religions, but we also have our own beliefs, and we are not like machines, na, like a steering wheel. Every other people can just turn as they wish, as they please. And then Bai also said when she felt discriminated, do not treat us, do not treat us like cattle that can be driven away from one place to another. Please don't do that. And in our rituals, we ask guidance from the spirits for our daily activities, for our economic survival. And our ancestors taught us only to get things inside the forest that are enough for our needs. So ancestors taught them to take something from the forest that are enough for their needs. So now we go to the planning part for development. The Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act requires every territory must have their own ancestral domain sustainable development protection plan or the ADS-DPP. So you can imagine that the cultural life of Mount Kitanglad is a driving force when people crafted their own plan. So the ADS-DPP of the Daraguyan Bukidnon tribe represents their deep and sacred aspirations as people. So their plan is a voice of their unity. They chart their own welfare. And it is their contribution and testament to protect the cultural heritage and environment inside the Mount Kitanglad Range Natural Park. So the drafting of the SDPP, you can imagine, includes the most comprehensive, diverse, creative process, and most of which are, I would say, innovative and emergent because this is now the generations of the tribe engaged in collective planning. Previously, there's none, but with the IPRA law, with the park management, they have to plan for development. So the essence of the plan is aged by time and the wisdom of their people as they strive to survive in the present context, also enhanced by the memories of the past and the histories of told by their ancestors. So with the SDPP, the development planners may come to understand the tribe's thinking and spirit as exemplified on how they relate to their environment. And I describe to have a pro-community, pro-environment, and conflict-free future development agenda. So they also have parameters for their development agenda, that it should be pro-community, pro-people, pro-environment, and it should be conflict-free development agenda. So that's DPP. It's a living document of the tribe, and it enhances individual and collective growth, and it also um, outlines their leadership capacity, their organizational health, as well as their cultural, social, emotional intelligence, all in practice, all at this moment. So they also reflect about development. They also criticize things that they cannot do, but they're willing to learn. They also uh, understand why people are angry at them, and they reflect on this rather than fighting, and problematize how come society cannot understand us as people, how we cannot also be understood by the government. So they try to comply with the state rules and guidelines, improve their ethnicity, their time immemorial existence, and they really downted all the obstacles through tenacity and humility. So this is very unique for the Kitanglad tribes. They face challenges squarely with tenacity and humility. So in their dreams and aspirations, the elders, the leaders, healers, the shaman, the successor generations among the youth and children, they started to conceive, everyone conceived what the plan should be. And they revealed it through daily musings, others in the arts, in the music. So it's like a crystal ball. So this plan has sounds, has music, has cultural fragments, has memories, movements. So this is very unique from technical plans that we are very comfortable with or used to. So can we mix culture and development? Yes, in the HDPP because it provides spiritual and cultural framework. And then from the framework, they come up with their own principles, goals, and strategies. But the tribes are also aware that coming with the DPP, it's not a cure-all instrument for development because it can still be met with obstacles. It's a fact that with the road that has potholes, it has cloudy days, and they know they need to pursue it no matter what. So they also understand that the plan is not straight bound because there's climate change. So every event, environmental event, they reflect on it and reshape the vision. And they know that they will not be out of their way to development because the nature spirits continue to guide them through the elders and the ritualists as these omens and signs are foretold during the ritual. So if they know there's a reason to celebrate for, they know that, or there's a reason to hold rituals, they also sense that from the environment. So process-wise, so we have a plan that is a covenant for the elders and the youngsters, and then all the values can be captured in this HDPP. So in the conclusion, if we say transformative development, if I would say in the case of Kitanglad, to pursue development with the cultural integrity, it should include the following tenets. Number one, if you work in a cultured space, you have to see culture as both unique for Talandi, Bukidnon, Higaonon, also pluralistic, because there's also the outside world, the non-IPs, the majority ethnic groups that plays the dynamics in Mount Kitanglad. So culture makes them different, but we will not say it's just the culture of Bukidnon. So it will be rash to say that it's really the culture of the Kinon because it's really a pluralistic space that navigates the dynamics, that characterize the dynamics in the homelands of Mount Kitanglad. So the tribes know that I have my culture, but if I enter the territory of Talandig, there's another culture that governs the particular area. Second, for transformative development, especially for the agencies, they must be able to accommodate culture. What does it mean? To accommodate culture for government, they have to recognize indigenous people's rights inside the area. After the protocols, they learn to observe rituals, and then when they're asked during the Sayuda and Pagumol-Amol meetings, which was initiated before by Dato Migitay, they know that have to come with respect because there's a ritual involved in these consultation meetings. On the side of the IPs, they also accommodated the economic development framework in the protected area because there's sustainable development, there's need to have livelihoods, there's need to have alternative incomes. So the tribes also accommodated this framework as introduced by the park management. So some of them kind of protested it, others in a subtle, accommodating gesture. For example, the tribes learned to organize themselves into people's organization, and they also organize themselves into cooperatives because this will qualify them to receive grants and support for livelihoods from uh, donors from either from the country or from the foreign donors. So that's also the compromise. So this is very important. The state can accommodate culture and development, but development in culture also can be is possible by accommodation on the side of the tribes. Third, it should also be the awareness of sacred spaces in protected areas. The sacred spaces still prevails in terms of the importance of Mount Kitanglad. So ancestral territory are basically the world where the tribes conduct sacred ceremonies. But in the outsider view, this is economic importance. The water Kitanglad has value for money, the aesthetic, the tourist, the ecological importance. But the idea is they should not reject the sacred notions of the tribe in order to work together. So that's when sacred and the economic view of a particular resource will kind of be overlapping, so it is prone to conflict. But the important thing is you have to respect the fundamental view of the tribe in terms of the sacredness of a particular area, of a mountain, of a river. So that should be accepted by the state. What is also a compromise, there should be a documentation of cultural zones, tribal policy, which is a good starting point so that the outside world will be informed what are the places that they need to follow cultural protocols. And we have done this initial documentation of 3 areas, 3 of the 8 areas surrounding Kitanglad. And so far, a large part of these cultural policies are still to be embedded in the protected area management. But what is very consoling, the park management recognizes, respect these cultural policies that were documented by Datu Makapukaw, along with the council elders and kin, who produced a book called Wisdom Keepers of Mount Kitanglad that contains oral traditions that were permitted to be written so as to guide the outside world on their dealings with Mount Kitanglad, and also to guide the new generations on the richness of their culture and history. The fourth aspect, for transformative development to occur, there should also be a recognition of rituals, the power of rituals. Because like in the park management, rituals very important, and the park management also accommodated this. And these are now important requirements in the conduct of research, consultations. So cultural rights are really is the first activity that must be conducted to ensure the success of all activities. When the IFRA law was approved in 1997 and the Mount Kitanglad Act was approved in 2001, this practice is already fully recognized and normalized in PA management. Lastly, about cultural energy and solidarity. The tribes are just there in isolation. There is government declaring protected area. So the role of a mediating institution like the Kitanglad Integrated NGO, my group, is to ensure that what are the cultural strength, life in Mount Kitanglad becomes visible for the government and for the IPs to participate is to ensure them that these rights will be respected. In the absence of that assurance, the tribe cannot heal its wound from being discriminated from government, from the private sector, because they are not understood. So what is important is that the show of cultural energy, the vibrance of culture, and spiritual culture is really important in terms of building on development. So here we have a picture of 350 volunteers of Mount Kitanglad. We started with 175 in 1999, so the number is still growing, and majority of them are IPs, and they serve as the eyes and ears in park management, so they watch for the violators, trespassers, so they ensure that the protected area is protected from all corners, from all localities. Next, you can see also the leaders of the three tribes, the Gaunon, these also form as the co-management for protected area. So giving examples that tribes can also work well with protected area management. And if you want to see what is the side of Mount Kitanglad, it's now famous for its coffee because elevation we produce a lot of Arabica coffee. There's also a revival of culture. There's a lot of expressions in the arts. And you can see also the group picture there that they are now part of the park management. So this is a view of Kitanglad from Balay. And for this sharing, you would know that nature and culture mattered in development. So this is the case of Mount Kitanglad. So, salamat, Mahid Masalong. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Ms. Canoy, for a comprehensive and insightful presentation. So we now extend the conversation to our audience, and there are, in fact, interesting questions addressed to Professor Hadiz and to Ms. Canoy. First, let us address some of the questions to Professor Hadiz. Some of the questions are quite similar, Professor, and I would try my best to combine them. No, most of the questions have something to do with the attraction or the appeal of oligarchic interests as far as their resurgence or their preservation in a democratic landscape is concerned. The first question has something to do with what makes them tick, no? What preserves their oligarchic sway or their hegemonic sway, if you may. And a second follow-up to that would be what has reform movements, or in the case of Indonesia, Reformasi, or in the case of the Philippines, EDSA in 1986, what did they miss out on, or what do they lack? Your thoughts, Professor.
On the second question there, what was lacking really was a formidable cross-class and coherently organized movement that could bring together civil society forces to impose a different kind of arrangements of power than would have been favored by the oligarchs. So, as I mentioned, we thought that Suharto fell, and all kinds of possibilities open. Well, not all things are possible on an equal level of possibility, if you understand what I mean, right? Not all things are possible at, at the same level. So when you don't have civil society groups that are currently organized, that they have a vision that at least temporarily unites themselves, what you do get then is a vacuum that is left unfilled when the forces of the status quo are kind of, in chaos. But because that vacuum never gets filled, then they can reorganize. And I saw one of the questions, and it was about whether democracy really was against the interests of oligarchy. And in fact, I'm saying, no, it's not. What the Indonesian oligarchy has come to realize is that, hey, you know what? We don't actually need authoritarianism. Democracy actually suits us quite well. In fact, it kind of limits the military's interventions into all of our, robbing of the public coffers. So democracy itself actually can bolster the power of oligarchy rather than undermine it. So if you ask what makes the oligarchy tick, it's democracy itself and their capacity to use democracy to continue rent-seeking economic activities. So control over the levers of economic and political power allows for the accumulation of private capital through control and access over social and public institutions and resources. That is what makes the oligarchy tick.
In that regard, Professor Hadiz, is there a way out of that conundrum?
Well, as I mentioned, if there was to be a way out of that conundrum, they would only appear very rarely, and they would appear mainly in times of crises, right? So, but even times of crises, don't give you a guarantee that transformation will occur, as I mentioned in my presentation. But that is at least, the necessary, requisite, not the sufficient, but necessary requisite, right? Now, what we do have right now across the world really is a time of crisis. But do we actually have the social forces and the social organizations with an alternative vision of how society should be organized, how power and wealth should be distributed, and so on, that actually can counter the dominant discourses that bolster the existing power structure? Across the world, I think we are lacking that, actually. And we have lacked that for decades in Southeast Asia.
Thank you very much, Professor Hadiz, for that insightful sharing, for those insights regarding, shall we say, the strength and the perpetuation of certain interest groups that have continued to aggrandize themselves economically and politically. Probably a last question for you, Professor Hadiz, before we set you free, so to speak.
To be a university bureaucrat again.
Yes, that's right. It has something to do with the role of academics / activists. Obviously, based on your narration of your experience, you're both. You were an activist, but at the same time, an academic. So moving forward in this current predicament, how do you see academic activists navigating this situation?
Well, I think that one needs to look at it, or one can profitably look at it in Gramscian terms, right? I think the academics and intellectuals need to be organically connected to social movements, right? Otherwise, they are just floating in the air, You know, they may be vocal, they may be on television all the time, in the newspapers and social media and so on, but they don't really have an effect if they are not organically connected to, society-based movements, right? And what you have there, if you don't have that, there is the potential that academics and intellectuals will be, instead of organically connected to social movements, organically connected to the powers that be. They can be technocrats, they can be consultants, they can be, advisors to political parties, power brokers, etc. Right? And we see that happening. Look, I know that happens in Indonesia, and I know that happens in the Philippines, and I know that happens in Thailand and various other places. Okay, and the reason for that is because, there aren't these really coherently organized social movements that actually can, from which organic intellectuals can arise. And therefore intellectuals tend to get absorbed into the existing vortex of power.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Hadiz. At this juncture, we would like to express our appreciation for taking time out, your busy schedule,
of my
your role as a bureaucrat, that's right, for sharing your insights with us. Hopefully in the future, we can still invite you when your schedule is lighter, relatively, and we can continue this conversation. So on that note, thank you very much, Professor Hadiz, for joining us for today.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. Bye-bye.
Okay, at this point, Ms. Canoy, we also have insightful questions for you. And we invite you to actually go over these questions and answer them as generously as possible, okay? The first question addressed to Ms. Canoy. All right. There is actually, okay. Let me read the question because a comment comes first before the question. Many customary laws are wise and sustainable. However, IPs tend to be considered, okay, and I put them in quotes, backward, and their rituals, practices, superstitious, again, in close quotes, Therefore, they are put in a much lower power position and their voices not heard. They even internalize such stereotypes and gradually lose their traditions as the young generation become disinterested. So the question goes, how did the IPs get into an equal position in the agreement with the government on nature protection in your case?
Okay, the one that says backward, quote unquote, cultural practice, superstitious, also like a criticism on the culture also. You can see the outsider looking in. But this outsider has no choice because we needed your forest. We needed the Philippine eagle. It should not be killed because it's a critically endangered species. We need to go to the forest for many, many benefits. So that's why the tribes have a good position. And there is a law that says in the NIPAS law, even if it's declared as a protected area, if there is an existing indigenous community, they have to respect culture. So I think in the Philippines, the respect of culture is very strong. I'm not sure for other areas, because as far as I know, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act is the only, Philippines the only country that come up with a clear prescription and policy for the respect of the fundamental rights of indigenous people, which include the rights to their land, to their territory, their cultural and human, social justice and human rights, and the rights to cultural integrity. Maybe for some other countries, they still lack the legal framework. So, for instance, in Mount Kitanglad, if you enter without permit from government, so much so with no ritual from the tribe, you will be run after too. So you will be easily apprehended by the tribal guards. So it may be backward, But at some point, if you have a stake in their territory, if you have like interest in terms of the economic and the wealth, natural capital, then I think you have to compromise yourselves. The second generation, when they see their parents and grandparents hurting and angry, they will also inherit the hurt and the anger. But if the mediating institution helps to try to heal the wounds for the tribes, for the tribal rights to be understood, that's practically a process of healing. So for now, the attitude of discrimination will no longer prosper if you're wanting to tribes to cooperate with your program, especially in the nation state you're in. They should have a say in terms of a co-management system.
Thank you very much, Ms. Canoy. A follow-up question to that, and I think this is a pretty interesting question because in your presentation, you did touch on the existing hierarchies, no, with IPs and other groups in society. The question goes: is there also ethnocentrism? No? When you talk about hierarchies, you also talk about realities like ethnocentrism. So in this case, is there also ethnocentrism among IPs? Have you experienced that, and probably in what ways?
IP discriminating other IP, seeing that their practice is much better than the others. For traditional cultural ones, maybe no, but for IPs exposed to outside, learning from us, they come back proud, knowledgeable. Like for instance, I will do better because I'm schooled, and your practice in the mountains and the forest, it will not apply here when you work with government, when you work with outside factors. So actually, the ones that sees the better comes out from the community. But between tribes, that's why they have the protocol of Sayuda Habatasan. It's a proper protocol that you have the right to inform us and be informed. And then we can strengthen the relationship from the proper information. So they have fundamental guidelines to how to conduct with each other. So there are cases, yes, it happens because the IP, the educated IP or the IP who has the beauty of the outside world brings it to the inside and say that, you know, you're not capable because you're only concentrating on our indigenous knowledge. You have to learn this way. So that's where the ethnocentric attitude comes. But we can dispel it if, for instance, we foster really the dynamics of the modern world, the traditional world. There's got to be a room for discussion. And for us in Kim, when I had a workshop with the council elders about how the outside world treats them. You can imagine your whole blackboard filled with so many descriptions of pain, discrimination, and I just say, okay, we filled up the board. Can we talk about the positive side? So we have to graduate from towards healing because otherwise, talking tough, talking angry, it's not part so much of the culture of the Bukidnon people that I know.
Thank you for that. Thank you for clarifying that, Ms. Canoy. And a related question has something to do with episodes where, and I'm sure probably you've encountered this, no, episodes where members of a particular indigenous group have compromised, no, traditional culture to accommodate a park management objective and vice versa. Can you give, let's say, specific examples where a group, an indigenous group, had to compromise certain ideals or certain customs or values probably so that development projects and their own traditions meet halfway? Have there been cases like that? And if so, what would be good examples?
Yeah, especially in terms of, well, many examples, but let me start with the economic side. Since one of the objective of Mount Kitanglad is to pursue sustainable development with the people, with the indigenous people who are inhabiting the protected area. But the outside support cannot come in if first the tribes, they have to be organized. So we actually organize them into people's organization, have to register them. They go through trainings, even financial management training, bookkeeping training, and this is really like we have not learned also like there's also the lack of assumption on the literacy level. Because for instance, like if you group them and then will be one is a treasurer, one is a signatory of the bank. So we actually, because the money comes from, for instance, from the World Bank to Land Bank, they cannot withdraw funds if they do not have signatures. But we found out majority of those we form into people's organization don't even have a concept of signatures. So do you know that some banks accept thumb marks? Like in Land Bank, we started with the thumb marks. And there was one chieftain who was discriminated because he doesn't have a consistent signature. He told the person in the bank, like, you know, most of my time, most of my life, I plow. I use my hand to plow. How can you expect me to have a consistent signature when I only get to write with important community meetings or perhaps during election? So don't blame me if I don't have really a consistent signature. So that's one compromise that we have to go to banks, we have to dress them like citizens of the republic, quote unquote, because if they go down to the mountains, they're being discriminated with how they look. They can even be construed as rebelde going down. So society is not prepared to be compassionate with indigenous people. And if only they know how much this tribe protect Mount Kitanglad, the intact forest, the biodiversity, then we should have a changing attitude. So the organization of the indigenous people into legal registered is a compromise before they get the money, because before they get support. Other than that, biodiversity monitoring. A group of park personnel will go to certain spots in the territory to say, the birds are here, you know, to look at indicators. But over the years, and some, as I mentioned, the Kitanglad Guards volunteers are mostly IPs. They are now trained to do biodiversity monitoring. But in one gathering with them, I said, can you do your own biodiversity monitoring? Do you understand one time I was speech and said, ma'am, we have a culturally significant animals. We have culturally significant plants. It's like, oh my God. So meaning to say, we are trying to fulfill our objectives on them, but we haven't even asked them if they can have a mechanism that complements the indigenous biodiversity monitoring with the scientific biodiversity monitoring. So, and they allow it to happen, and they just said like, anyway, they didn't ask about it. So you know, there's also like silencing, just letting it happen, just to minimize conflict. But if you can say, you can ask them, there's really something indigenous for everything that can be done in Mount Kitanglad. And there's so much of that that we have yet to uncover and really pursue with respect.
Thank you very much, Ms. Canoy. I think a final question for you. No, we don't want to hold you that long. No,
Yeah,
and I know you're busy. So many engagements. A final question for you has something to do with notions of development, which you mentioned. No, you mentioned Kalambuan and some other notions of development that are organically indigenous. No, the question goes: how do members of these indigenous groups, particularly those who work closely with you, Ms. Canoy, how do they ascertain? Now, they have notions of what development is, that's pretty clear. But how do they ascertain which is better? Or do they have that? No? Is it important for them to actually determine which type of development is better? Do they distinguish? Thank you.
yeah. So that's also a very good question. There was one case of an investor who wants to promote coffee for the tribes. And then he was already going through several stages of consultation. Now, every stage of the consultation involves ritual. And the youths, they were telling me like they were not comfortable with the investor. They were not comfortable. And then Bai said that he read some papers and she feels like there's something not good with it. And during the ritual for the confirmation, the omens came. So they just said no. They just said no. Right. And the investor said, I can send you to school. I can give you this one. So like just allow me to, to promote coffee and, plant more coffee in your territory. And they just said, no, it's final. They say it's no. And since I can have to listen to their feedback in terms of ritual, the kids also knew that the spirits were with them for disallowing the project. So what is acceptable or not, the human decision matters. But if during the ritual the omens will come, that will also, like say, not confirm acceptance. So the conscience, the guiding of the conscience is the guidance of the spirit. So it's interesting.
Thank you very much for your generosity in going over these questions, Ms. Canoy. Before we set you free, so to speak, any parting words or statements regarding transformative development in the context of the IP's experiences?
Yeah. Um, well, I work with IPs for almost 30 years now as an anthropologist, but I also wear different hats. And I also like to cross different domains of peoples, of societies, of groups. And I knew somehow that transformative from the side of what the Kitanglad people has taught me. Transformative is like sticking to value. Um, it transforms as you go to a different time of the day, the next day, the next day. The transformative aspect is the external changes, but the value inside remains. And transformative is the ability to see longer and wider field and see a broad spectrum of dynamics. But your stability inside, your interiority really matters. So I said transformative development is really not being busy about constructions, a lot of the physicals of it. A lot of it is in the quietude inside. And the tribes, they're there for development actually. So we have tribal halls that designed by modern architects from UP, and they work with the tribes. They listen to the tribes and they visualize. They don't impose models. They listen and then they sketch and then they show. They capture. So the transformative is that being in the aha moment that you can be learned, you can be taught, but it's for the better, like development that knowing that this one that's no longer practical, but we moved on, but we don't compromise values. So I think that's a very strong message that I really like in your webinar. And I knew somehow I need to speak and share and give time because I know there's got to be a point where everybody calls for transformative development. But if our foundation of values, as the tribes have shown, is very firm, as long as we also have that on our own from our guidance of our parents, from our teachers and mentors, I think the human in us can transform every day. But the value that would change us, that will disregard the non-material, the spiritual aspects, then perhaps the time we will lose our humanity, our sense of true being. So transformative, it's like elastic, it's inside, it's adaptive, but it continues to be wise, righteous, it's one sense of your righteousness, and it's all for the good of everyone, not just for humans, but for all the biodiversity, as what the tribe said. They have to be respected because they have a right in the space, in the domain. So I hope that also conveys a good inspirational message to everyone who listens to this webinar.
brilliantly conveyed, Ms. Canoy. It was insightful, it
po.
was comprehensive, it was poignant, Shai. Very thankful for having you here. So on that note, again, we would like to express our gratitude to our two resource speakers, distinguished guests for this afternoon's webinar, Professor Vedi Hadiz from the University of Melbourne, and Miss Easterluna Luz Canoy, leader of IP NGO group. For 30 years now, she's been engaged with indigenous peoples, and she has given her time and expressed her, shall we say, gratitude for giving her space in this webinar series. So on that note, again, we would like to thank the Ateneo Department of Sociology and Anthropology in cooperation with the University for Peace in Costa Rica, the Nippon Foundation, and the Asian Peacebuilders Scholarship Program, as well as the DSA's home organization, the Kalipunang Sociologia at Anthropologia, for our posters and for other conference paraphernalia. We would like to thank you all for this collaborative production, and we hope to see you again in our future webinar conversations, which we promise to be as stimulating and as, shall we say, intellectually gratifying as possible. So thank you very much and good afternoon. Jai, maraming salamat.